The bandits cornered the pretty girl behind the barn, but the loner rancher was already loading his rifle. The sun hung low over the dusty expanse of Copper Creek Valley, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of the McKenna Ranch. James Hartwell adjusted his worn Stetson and squinted through the amber light, watching the dust cloud on the horizon grow larger. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving fast toward the settlement. In his gut, he knew it meant trouble. James had lived alone on his small spread for the better part of 5 years now, ever since he drifted into the valley with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and memories he'd rather forget. The townspeople of Copper Creek had learned to respect his desire for solitude, and he'd learned to keep his business to himself. But today felt different. Today the very air seemed charged with menace. He set down the fence post he'd been working on and walked toward his cabin, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The Winchester was where he always kept it, propped against the doorframe, loaded and ready. A man didn't survive long on the frontier without being prepared for whatever came riding over the horizon. The riders were closer now, close enough that James could make out their silhouettes against the dying light. They wore the rough clothing of drifters, their hats pulled low, and something about the way they rode, hard and purposeful, made his jaw tighten. He'd seen their kind before in other places, other times. Men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their way. From his vantage point on the small rise where his cabin sat, James had a clear view of the McKenna place about a quarter-mile down the valley. Old Tom McKenna had built himself a fine spread over the years, with a sturdy house, a big red barn, and corrals that held some of the finest horses in the territory. More importantly, Tom had a daughter. Sarah McKenna was 22, with golden hair that caught the sunlight and eyes blue as a summer sky. She was also one of the few people in Copper Creek who'd ever shown James any kindness, bringing him fresh bread and preserves when he'd been laid up with a bullet wound the previous winter. The riders had reached the McKenna place now, and James felt his blood run cold as he watched them dismount near the barn. Even from this distance, he could see Sarah emerge from the house, probably drawn by the sound of horses. She stood on the porch for a moment, shading her eyes with one hand, before one of the men called out to her. James couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language well enough. The men spread out, casual-like but with the practiced ease of wolves circling prey. Sarah took a step back toward the house, but one of the men was already moving to cut off her retreat. "Damn," James muttered, reaching for his rifle. He'd hoped to live out his days in peace, but it seemed peace was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when there was an innocent girl in trouble. He checked the Winchester's action, making sure a round was chambered, then grabbed his gun belt and strapped it on. The Colt .45 at his hip had served him well in darker days, and he had a feeling he might need it before this evening was through. Moving quickly but quietly, James saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger that had been his companion through many hard miles. As he rode down toward the McKenna place, he kept to the tree line, using the gathering shadows for cover. The scene that greeted him as he drew closer made his blood boil. The 4 men had cornered Sarah behind the barn, just as he'd feared. Their leader, a big man with a thick black beard, was doing the talking while his companions blocked any escape route. Sarah pressed herself against the barn wall, her face pale but determined. "Come now, missy," the bearded man was saying, his voice carrying a cruel edge. "No need to make this harder than it has to be. We're just looking for a little hospitality, if you catch my meaning." "My father will be back soon," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear James could see in her eyes. "You'd best be gone when he arrives." The man laughed, a harsh sound that grated like metal on stone. "Old Tom won't be back for hours, and we know. Saw him heading into town with that wagon of his." "No, darling, it's just you and us for now." James had heard enough. He dismounted about 50 yards away, tying Ranger to a cottonwood tree. The Winchester felt solid and familiar in his hands as he worked his way closer, using the barn itself for cover. The bandits were so focused on their prey that they never noticed the shadow moving through the twilight. When he was close enough to make out every word, James stopped and took careful aim. The leader was still talking, his voice growing more threatening by the moment. "Boys, I think this little filly needs some convincing. Maybe we should. Maybe you should think again, friend." James's voice cut through the evening air like a blade, causing all four men to spin around. He stood at the corner of the barn, the Winchester trained on the leader's chest, his face hard as granite in the fading light. "Well, well," the bearded man said, his hand dropping casually toward his gun. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero, boys." "You picked the wrong fight, stranger." "Could be," James replied, his voice level and calm, "but I'm thinking you picked the wrong girl to threaten. You boys want to mount up and ride out. This can end peaceful like. Otherwise," he let the threat hang in the air, the tension stretched taut as a fiddle string. James could see the calculations running behind the leader's eyes, 4 against 1, but the stranger had the drop on them. It was the kind of moment that could go either way depending on how much backbone the bandits had. "You know, mister," the leader said slowly, "there's 4 of us and only 1 of you. Those ain't good odds." "Depends on how you look at it," James replied. "Way I see it, I can put 2 of you down before you clear leather, and my colt will take care of the rest. Question is which 2 of you want to die first." One of the younger bandits, a nervous-looking kid with quick eyes, took a half-step backward. "Maybe we should just ride on. Cole ain't worth dying over." The leader, Cole, apparently shot him a withering look. "Shut your mouth, Billy. Nobody asked you." He turned back to James, his hand still hovering near his gun. "You talk big for a man outnumbered 4 to 1. Talk's cheap, James. If you're going to make a play, best get to it. Daylight's burning." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant lowing of cattle. Sarah pressed herself against the barn wall, her blue eyes wide as she watched the deadly tableau unfold. Then Cole made his choice. His hand flashed toward his gun, and the evening exploded into violence. James's Winchester spoke first, the heavy slug catching Cole in the chest and spinning him around. The other 3 bandits were drawing iron, but James was already working the rifle's lever, sending another round into the chamber. The second shot took down a thin man with a scraggly mustache before his gun cleared leather. James rolled to his left as bullets whined past his ear, using a water trough for cover. His rifle was empty now, but his Colt was in his hand, smooth as silk, the familiar weight reassuring against his palm. The nervous kid Billy was shooting wild, his bullets splintering wood and kicking up dirt everywhere but where James crouched. The fourth man, a stocky fellow with cold eyes, was more dangerous. His shots came close enough that James felt the heat of one bullet as it passed his cheek. James rose from behind the trough and put 2 quick shots into the stocky man's center mass, dropping him like a stone. That left Billy, who was backing away frantically, his gun clicking on empty chambers. "Don't shoot," Billy cried, dropping his weapon and raising his hands. "I give up. I give up." James kept his Colt trained on the young man as he stepped out from behind the trough. "Smart choice, kid. Now get down on your belly, hands behind your head." Billy complied quickly, terror written across his face. James glanced around at the carnage, noting that Cole was still breathing, though blood frothed at his lips. The other 2 were past caring about anything earthly. "Sarah," James called without taking his eyes off the prisoners. "You hurt?" "No," came her shaky reply. "No, I'm all right. Thank you, James. Thank you. Better get some rope from the barn. We'll tie up the live ones for the sheriff." As Sarah hurried to fetch rope, James kept watch over Billy while checking on Cole. The bandit leader was gut-shot and dying, his breathing shallow and labored. "Should have taken the advice," Cole wheezed, blood speckling his beard. "Should have rode on." "Yeah," James said quietly. "You should have." Cole's eyes fixed on him with dying clarity. "You ain't no ordinary rancher. I seen you before, back in Tombstone. You're Hartwell." James Hartwell. James felt his stomach drop. That name belonged to another life, another man he'd tried to leave behind. "You're mistaken, friend." "No mistake," Cole gasped. The shootist. They said you was fast as lightning." "Guess they was right." The bandit leader's eyes rolled back and his breath rattled to a stop. James stared down at the dead man, feeling the weight of his past settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He'd come to Copper Creek to escape the reputation that followed him, to live quietly and let James Hartwell the gunfighter fade into legend. But some ghosts were harder to bury than others. "Here's the rope," Sarah said, returning with a coil of hemp. She glanced at Cole's still form and shuddered. "Is he?" "Yeah," James said simply. He took the rope and began tying Billy's hands behind his. The young bandit was crying now, great sobs that shook his whole body. "Please don't let them hang me," Billy pleaded. I didn't want to hurt nobody. Cole made us do it, said it would be easy money. That'll be for a judge to decide, James told him, though his voice wasn't unkind. You chose to ride with this bunch. Now you got to face the consequences. As he finished securing the prisoner, James became aware that Sarah was studying his face in the gathering darkness. When he looked up, he found her blue eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. That man knew you, she said quietly. He called you by name. James Hartwell. James stood slowly, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He'd known this moment would come eventually. In the West, word traveled fast, and men with reputations found it hard to hide for long. Could be he was mistaken, James said, though they both knew it was a lie. Sarah shook her head. The way you handled those men, that wasn't luck or accident. You've done this before, many times. James was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind sigh through the cottonwood. Finally, he met her gaze. I came here to leave that life behind, Sarah. I'm not that man anymore, but you were, she pressed gently. You were the James Hartwell, the gunfighter. I was a lot of things I ain't proud of, James admitted, but that's done now. I just want to live in peace. Sarah stepped closer, her face soft with understanding. You saved my life tonight. Whatever you were before, that's what matters to me. Before James could respond, the sound of horses approaching made them both turn. A group of riders was coming from town, led by a familiar figure, Tom McKenna, Sarah's father. Behind him rode Sheriff Morrison, and several other townsmen. Sarah, Tom called out as he dismounted, rushing to embrace his daughter. We heard gunshots. Are you hurt? I'm fine, Papa, Sarah assured him. James saved me. Sheriff Morrison, a grizzled veteran of many frontier troubles, surveyed the scene with professional interest. 3 dead men, 1 prisoner, and James Hartwell standing calm as you please with a smoking gun in his hand. Looks like we missed all the excitement, Morrison said dryly. These the boys who've been raising hell across the territory. Could be, James replied. They seemed to know their business when it came to threatening innocent folk. The sheriff nodded, then fixed James with a steady look. Mighty fine shooting, Mr. Hartwell. Course, some folks might wonder how a simple rancher got so handy with iron. James met the lawman's gaze without flinching. Some folks might wonder about a lot of things, Sheriff. Doesn't mean they need answers. Morrison chuckled, surprising everyone. Fair enough, far as I'm concerned. You did the territory a service tonight. These boys have been wanted for robbery and worse across 3 counties. There's paper out on all of them. What about him? James nodded toward Billy, who was still sniffling on the ground. He'll get a fair trial, Morrison said, though riding with this bunch ain't going to win him any sympathy from a jury. As the sheriff and his men loaded the bodies and secured the prisoner, Tom McKenna approached James. The older man's weathered face was serious but grateful. I owe you more than I can ever repay, Tom said, extending his hand. My Sarah is all I got left in this world. James shook the offered hand. No debt between neighbors, Tom. Any man would have done the same. Not any man could have done what you did, Tom replied. That was some of the finest shooting I ever witnessed. Where'd you learn to handle guns like that? The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. James was aware that everyone was listening. The sheriff, the townsmen, Sarah. His past was catching up to him whether he liked it or not. Here and there, James said finally, a man picks up skills where he can. Tom nodded, understanding that some questions were better left unasked. Well, whatever your story, you're welcome at my table any time. Sarah's told me how you helped her through her sickness last winter, and now that you're good people, James Hartwell. As the group prepared to head back to town, Sarah lingered beside James. The stars were coming out overhead, bright pinpricks in the vast western sky. Will you be all right? She asked softly. Out there by yourself? James looked down at her, seeing genuine concern in her eyes. It had been a long time since anyone had worried about his welfare. I'll be fine, always have been. That's not what I meant, Sarah said. I know what people will say now, about who you are, what you've. It won't be easy carrying that burden. James was quiet for a moment, touched by her understanding. Reckon every man's got to carry his own load, he said finally. Past don't change, but a man can choose what he does with his future. Sarah smiled, and even in the starlight, he could see the warmth in her expression. Then choose wisely, James Hartwell. You've got friends here, whether you want them or not. She turned and walked toward her father's horse, leaving James standing alone in the shadow. He watched her go, feeling something stir in his chest that he'd thought long dead. Hope, maybe, or just the possibility of it. Sheriff Morrison paused beside him as the group mounted up. "Word's going to spread about tonight," the lawman said quietly. "Might bring trouble your way. Men looking to make a reputation have a way of finding famous gunfighters." "I ain't looking for trouble," James replied. "Never thought you were," Morrison said. "But trouble has a way of finding us regardless. You watch yourself, Hartwell. This territory's got need of good men like you." As the riders disappeared into the darkness, James stood alone beside the barn where it had all happened. The bodies were gone, the blood would wash away with the next rain, but the consequences of this night would linger. Word would spread, as the sheriff had said. Men would come looking for the famous James Hartwell, wanting to test their speed against his reputation. But as he looked up at the stars wheeling overhead, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. For the first time since coming to Copper Creek Valley, he felt like more than just a man hiding from his past. Tonight, he'd been a protector, a friend, a neighbor. Maybe that was worth whatever trouble might come. He walked back to where Ranger waited patiently, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. The ride back to his cabin was quiet, with only the whisper of wind and the distant call of a night bird for company. But the solitude no longer felt like isolation, it felt like peace. As he unsaddled his horse, and cleaned his weapons by lamplight, James thought about Sarah's words. "Choose wisely," she'd said. Well, he'd made his choice long ago when he drifted into this valley looking for a place to disappear. But tonight had shown him that a man couldn't really disappear from himself. The past would always be there, like a shadow at noon. The question was what to do with it. He could run again, find another valley, another name, another life, or he could stay and face whatever came, knowing that he had friends here worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that. James blew out the lamp and settled into his bunk, the Winchester within easy reach as always. Outside, the night wind whispered secrets to the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. It was the sound of the frontier, wild and free and dangerous. But for the first time in years, James Hartwell slept without nightmares, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, he'd found something worth more than solitude. He'd found a home. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of another scorching day. James was up before sunrise, as was his habit, tending to his animals, and checking his water supply. The routine was comforting, a reminder that some things remained constant, even when the world turned upside down. He was repairing a section of fence when he saw the rider approach. For a moment, his hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he recognized the figure as Tom McKenna long before the older man drew close enough to call out. "Morning, James," Tom said, dismounting near the cabin. "Thought I'd ride over and see how you were faring after last night's excitement." "Morning, Tom. Coffee's on if you want some." They sat on James's small porch, drinking strong black coffee and watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks. It was Tom who finally broke the comfortable silence. "Sheriff Morrison rode back from the county seat this morning," he said. "Turns out there was a $1,000 bounty on that Cole fellow. Dead or alive?" James nodded but said nothing. Bounty money had never meant much to him. Gold couldn't buy back a clean conscience or erase the memories of men who'd fallen before his gun. "Morrison says the money's yours by right," Tom continued. "Figured you'd want to know." "Don't need it," James said simply. "Let the town keep it for something useful. School fund maybe." Tom studied his neighbor's profile, seeing something there that confirmed his growing suspicions about the man's character. "You know, James, I've been thinking about last night, about how you handled those men. That wasn't the work of an ordinary cowpoke." James took a sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Every man's got his secrets, Tom. Some are best left buried." "Agreed," Tom said. "But some secrets are worth knowing, especially when they concern the safety of folks you care about. Sarah told me what that dying bandit said, about Tombstone." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in James's mouth. He'd hoped that particular detail might go unnoticed, but Sarah was too smart for that, and she'd clearly shared her concerns with her father. "That was a long time ago," James said finally. "Different man, different life." "Maybe so," Tom replied. "But skills like yours don't just disappear, and frankly knowing what you're capable of makes me sleep easier at night. This is dangerous country, James. Good men with guns are hard to come by." They sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in his own thoughts. Finally Tom set down his empty cup and stood to leave. "There's something else," he said. his tone carefully neutral. Sarah's been asking about you. More than neighborly concern if you catch my meaning. James felt heat rise in his cheeks. Tom, now don't go getting all tongue-tied on me, Tom said with a chuckle. Sarah's a grown woman, and she makes her own choices, but she's also my only child, and I love her more than life itself. If you've got feelings for her, I need to know your intentions. The directness of the question caught James off guard. In his previous life, no one had ever asked about his intentions toward anything except which man he planned to kill next. The idea that someone might consider him worthy of a good woman's affections was almost incomprehensible. I'm not sure I'm the kind of man she deserves, James said honestly. Got too much blood on my hands, too many ghosts following me around. Tom nodded thoughtfully. Every man's got regrets, James. The measure of a man isn't what he's done, but what he does with the chance to do better. You saved my daughter's life. That counts for something in my book. After Tom left, James found it hard to concentrate on his work. The older man's words kept echoing in his mind, along with the memory of Sarah's blue eyes and gentle smile. Could a man like him really hope for something as precious as love? Could the past be truly forgiven, or would it always stand between him and any chance at happiness? The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, James was breaking a young Mustang in his corral when he spotted dust on the horizon. 2 riders this time, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't fleeing from anything, but something about their approach made his instincts prickle with warning. As they drew closer, James could make out more details. Both men were young, probably in their 20s, with the lean build and confident bearing of professional gunfighters. Their horses were good quality, their gear well maintained, and their guns worn with the casual readiness of men who used them for a living. They reined up outside his corral, studying him with the calculating gaze of predators sizing up potential prey. The taller of the two, a blond man with pale eyes and a thin mustache, spoke first. You James Hartwell. James continued working with the Mustang, not looking directly at the strangers. Depends on who's asking. Name's Carson, the blond man said. Jake Carson. This here's my partner, Miguel Santos. We heard about the excitement over at the McKenna place. Heard James Hartwell was involved. You heard wrong, James said, finally turning to face them. Name's James Hart. I ranch here. Carson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Now that's interesting, because the description we got matches you pretty close, and that shooting the other night, well, let's just say it had a certain style to it. Professional style. Santos, a dark-haired man with quick hands and watchful eyes, spoke for the first time. We've come a long way to meet the famous James Hartwell. Heard he was the fastest gun in Arizona territory. Thought we might test that reputation. James felt the familiar cold settle in his stomach. This was what he'd feared, what Sheriff Morrison had warned him about. His past had finally caught up with him, and now it threatened not just his peaceful life, but the safety of everyone he'd come to care about. Like I said, you boys got the wrong man, James repeated. I suggest you move along. Nothing for you here. Carson's smile widened. Oh, I think there is. See, we've got a proposition for you, Mr. Hartwell. A job, you might say. Good money too. Not interested. Haven't heard the offer yet, Santos said. There's a man in El Paso, name of Valdez. He's got need of someone with your particular skills. Pays well for the right kind of work. James knew the name. Esteban Valdez was a wealthy rancher with ties to both sides of the border, a man who used violence as casually as other men used words, the kind of employer James had left behind when he'd given up the gun-for-hire business. Already told you you got the wrong man, James said, his voice hardening. Now I'm asking you polite to move along. Carson's hand moved slightly closer to his gun. And if we don't, what then, Mr. Hart? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. James could see the decision forming in Carson's eyes. The moment when talk would give way to action. He'd been in this position too many times before, facing men who thought killing him would make their reputation. Then you'll find out just how wrong you are about who I am, James said quietly. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Carson's hand flashed downward, and the afternoon exploded into violence once again. But James was no longer the man who'd faced the bandits 3 nights ago. This was James Hartwell in his element, the gunfighter whose name had become legend across the frontier. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord, the draw so fast it was almost invisible. Carson's gun had barely cleared leather when James's first shot took him in the chest, spinning him from the saddle. Santos was faster, getting his weapon out and firing, but his shot went wide as James's second bullet found its mark.
Both men lay motionless in the dust beside their horse. James stood in his corral, smoke rising from the barrel of his Colt, feeling the familiar mixture of regret and relief that always followed such encounters. He tried to avoid this, but some things seemed inevitable as the sunrise. The sound of approaching horses made him look up. A small group of riders was coming from town, drawn by the gunshots. As they drew closer, James recognized Sheriff Morrison in the lead, followed by Tom McKenna and several other townsmen. "Seems like you're making a habit of this," Morrison said dryly as he surveyed the scene. "These boys give you any choice in the matter?" "They came looking for James Hartwell," James replied, holstering his weapon. "When I told them they had the wrong man, they decided to prove otherwise." Morrison nodded, examining the bodies. "Jake Carson and Miguel Santos," he said after a moment. "Wanted for murder in 3 territories. Looks like you did the law another favor." Tom McKenna approached, his face grave. "This is going to bring more of them, isn't it? More men looking to test themselves against your reputation." James looked around at the faces of the townsmen, seeing concern but no condemnation. These were frontier people, and they understood the harsh realities of life on the edge of civilization. But he also knew Tom was right. Word of this encounter would spread, just as word of the fight at the McKenna place had spread. More gunfighters would come, drawn by the chance to face the legendary James Hartwell. "Probably," James admitted. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" Sheriff Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you're planning to stick around." James was quiet for a moment, thinking about Sarah's words from the other night. "Choose wisely," she'd said. Well, maybe it was time to make a choice and stick with it, whatever the consequence. "This is my home," he said finally. "I ain't running anymore." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good. Because truth is, we could use a man of your ability. There's talk of trouble brewing with some of the bigger ranches, and the territorial government's been asking for help dealing with the bandit problem. Might be we could make this official, like you offering me a badge?" "Deputy Marshal," Morrison confirmed. "Federal appointment, good pay, and the backing of the law. Might discourage some of the young guns looking to make their reputation." James considered the offer. It would mean embracing his past rather than running from it, using his skills in service of the law instead of the highest bid. It was a chance at redemption, a way to balance the scales for all the violence he'd brought into the world. "I'll think about it," he said.
As the sheriff and his men dealt with the bodies, Tom McKenna lingered behind. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "Sarah's been worried sick since the shooting started. She's at the house, probably wearing a hole in the porch with her pacing." James felt his heart tighten. The thought of Sarah worrying about him was both wonderful and terrible. Wonderful because it meant she cared, terrible because it meant he was already drawing her into the dangerous world he'd tried to leave behind. "Maybe I should ride over and let her know I'm all right," he said. Tom smiled for the first time that day. "Maybe you should. And James, whatever you decide about Morrison's offer, know that you've got friends here. People who care about what happens to you." The ride to the McKenna place gave James time to think about everything that had happened. In the space of less than a week, his quiet life had been shattered beyond repair. But instead of feeling bitter about it, he found himself oddly hopeful. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond mere survival. He had people to protect, a community to serve, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at the kind of life he'd never dared dream about. Sarah was indeed pacing on the porch when he rode up, her golden hair catching the afternoon sunlight. When she saw him, relief flooded her features, and she ran down the steps to meet him. "James, thank God you're all right. We heard the shooting," and she stopped, seeming to realize how her concern might be interpreted. James dismounted and stood before her, hat in his hands. "I'm fine, Sarah. No one got hurt except the men who came looking for trouble." "It's going to keep happening, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "More men will come, more violence." James nodded reluctantly. "Probably. The question is whether you can live with that. Whether any of you can." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, seeing the uncertainty there, the fear that his past would poison any chance at happiness. Finally, she reached out and took his hand. "James Hartwell," she said softly, "I've seen you face down killers without flinching, but you're terrified of a small-town girl who bakes bread and tends chickens. Why is that?" The question caught him off guard. Because bullets I can handle, he said honestly. But this, what I feel for you, that scares me more than any gunfighter ever could. Sarah's smile was radiant. Good, she said. A man should be a little scared of love. It means he knows how precious it is. Before James could respond, she rose on her toes and kissed him gently. It was soft and sweet, and full of promise, everything he'd never thought he deserved. When they broke apart, he saw his future reflected in her blue eyes, and for the first time in his life, it looked bright. So what happens now? Sarah asked. James looked out over the valley, his valley now where he'd found peace and purpose and love. Now I stop running. Sheriff Morrison offered me a deputy marshal's badge, thought I might take him up on it. And after that, James smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. After that I was hoping a certain young lady might consider marrying a reformed gunfighter turned lawman. Sarah's laughter was like music. I think that could be arranged, she said, but only if he promises to come home to me every night. That's one promise I intend to keep, James said, pulling her close. Whatever it takes. As the sun set over Copper Creek Valley, James Hartwell finally understood what he'd been searching for all these years. Not an escape from his past, but a reason to transcend it. Not solitude, but belonging. Not just survival but life itself, full and rich and worth fighting for. The bandits who'd cornered Sarah behind the barn had thought they were taking something precious. Instead, they'd given James something even more valuable, the chance to become the man he'd always wanted to be. And that, he thought as he held the woman he loved in his arms, was worth every battle he'd ever fought. The frontier was still dangerous, and there would be more challenges ahead, but James Hartwell was no longer facing them alone. He had a community, a purpose and love, and that made him more powerful than any reputation ever could.